Hey guys, Aaron Cybertron Zhang here, and today I'm going to be doing a team report on the Groudon and Solgaleo team that I used to finish in the top 8 of the Salt Lake City Regional Championships, which was the first US VGC 2022 Regionals of the season. It was also my first time competing in a very long time. I have focused more on commentary and content creation in the last couple of years, so it was really exciting to get back to playing, and I honestly had so much fun with this team. So I'll timestamp everything in the description below. There's also a rental and a paste down there if you want to try out the team yourselves. And while I normally focus on battling content on this channel, I really enjoy making, new kinds of content like this. So if this is something you enjoy, please share support by leaving a like in the video. I'd really appreciate it, and I would love any feedback down in the comment section below. So yeah, let's just jump right into things. The areas that we'll cover in this video obviously include the breakdown of the team itself, but I also wanted to basically give you some color on how I was thinking about the metagame going into the Salt Lake City Regional Championships, the team building process, and basically how I was thinking about approaching the tournament, the actual team, a report on a bunch of the games that I had at Salt Lake City, and then just some concluding words. So as I previously mentioned, everything is timestamped in the description below, but I do think that each area has some unique insight that I hope you appreciate. So the first thing that I always try to do before starting to think about team building for any event is to just do an overview of the metagame. I try to basically dissect where I think the metagame has been and where it's going, and basically try to understand what I think the top compositions, Pokemon, and strategies going into an event are going to be. The metagame is always evolving, and so, the answer to this is always going to be a little bit different for each event that you attend, but I think it's important to just have some expectation of what you think will be popular, because then that can help influence, your final team decision. And for me, I normally want to go into an event with a team that I think at least gives me a favorable matchup against the majority of things that I expect to see. So I think it's always good to start just with the big picture and just think about what you think will be popular. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my, approach for this tournament and how I thought about the metagame going into it. The first thing is looking at top archetypes. Going into this event, there were basically 5 kind of archetypes that I expected to be really strong, and I expected that a lot of top players would bring. Now, obviously, this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but these were, in my eyes, just some of the most common ones and some of the strongest ones, where, yeah, maybe I'd expect some opponents to run variations of these, but generally, I would expect that a lot of top players kind of, picked one of these compositions going into the tournament. And so the restricted duo is the more important part for each of these, and then the support ones, like I just listed an example of a team for each of these archetypes, but there's obviously a lot of flexibility in the support Pokemon that you may want to throw in. So Kyogre and Zacian is one that, needs really no explanation, but sometimes you'll see it with Tailwind, for example, rather than with bulky Grimmsnarl and Screens. And so I knew this would be popular, and it actually had won the first regionals in Australia a couple weeks ago, a Whimsicott variant. And so, yeah, I knew, Kyogre and Zacian, just one of the most flexible restricted duos, continues to be the case. Groudon and Zacian, also very common, and we had actually featured it on the channel, a couple of weeks ago, and there had been one particular version of this team that was running around. A lot of players had adapted that team actually for Salt Lake Regionals, but continues to just be one of the best archetypes, and I knew it would be popular going into the event as well. The other 3 duos, I think maybe not as common in terms of just, number of people running it, but I figured that these were all really strong, and I expected to see some variations throughout the event. So Yveltal and Zacian is one. I think Yveltal, initially seen as a really bulky Pokemon, a lot of players now recently have been using a Life Orb variant and just hyper offense, Dynamax it on turn 1 and just overwhelm your opponent with offense. And so I'd expected to see that specifically going into this tournament. Calyrex Shadow Rider plus Zacian Hyper Offense. I think this is not as common, but I just played a lot of games against it while practicing, and it always felt like it could be really overwhelming. So I wanted to make sure that I didn't just lose to variants of this team basically within turn 1 and turn 2, because it normally features some of the fastest and hardest hitting Pokemon in the format. And then finally, Calyrex Ice Rider and Palkia. This is an archetype that really, I feel like, surged in popularity maybe a week or 2 leading up into regionals, and it had been performing really well on the online ladder in some of the international challenges as well. And even though not a ton of players were using it, I knew that this team was on the radar for a good number of top players going into the event. So basically, these were the 5 teams that I wanted to at least have some concrete game plan against, and wanted to bring a team that at least had neutral matchups against all of these. In addition, there were some other, pairs of Pokemon and noteworthy sets that I had identified and didn't necessarily think they'd be meta breaking or anything, but I just wanted to keep them in consideration as I was approaching regionals, right? So in terms of less common pairs of restricteds, I thought there was a lot of interesting things you could do with Solgaleo and Dialga, and I thought both of those restricteds were really underexplored relative to things like Kyogre, Zacian, and Groudon, for example. And then Zamazenta and Zygarde is a duo that I've run into on the ladder a bunch against high-ranked players, and I feel like I always kind of struggled against it. So even though I didn't think too many players, if any, would bring it to the tournament, I wanted to at least, have that in mind and have some approach as to how I could beat it. In terms of noteworthy sets, the Iron Defense Body Press Calyrex Ice Rider, which we'd featured on the channel a couple of weeks ago, I thought would be particularly strong and something to keep in mind. EVO users like Porygon 2 and Dusclops have definitely been making a comeback, especially with slower and more Trick Room-oriented teams. Bearscoot and Seismitoad, just really fast-paced hyper offense with Kyogre, Zacian, and often Whimsicott. New Fake-Out users like Alolan, Persian, and Sableye. Noted various Regieleki sets here just because I had started to see, dual screen sets from Aleki or physical Aleki or Assault Vest Aleki, so I just want to keep that in mind. And it's funny just calling out Amoonguss here, but Amoonguss is a Pokemon that has always been good, and I thought that players were kind of, not using as much as I'd expected it, and I had started to see it more often, especially on some of those slower paced teams, so I also wanted a good answer against that Pokemon specifically. So now that I had sat down and thought about the metagame, I wanted to start thinking about what team to actually bring to the event. And like I mentioned, ideally I wanted something that would give me a neutral to favorable matchup against most of the things that I had previously listed. So going into this event, and going into most tournaments that I've really competed in, I like to generally take one of two approaches. The first one is to take a popular concept and then just optimize it for the metagame. That could be in a variety of different ways, right? Maybe re-EVing something so that you have a significant edge in the mirror matchup, or adding in a surprise move that no one really expects, or maybe taking a Pokemon that's run in a conventional way and then running it in an unconventional way on a popular team. The second is to use something that few people expect, whether that be a Pokemon, a strategy, or even a move. And so, I was thinking about which approach I wanted to take going into this regionals, and I didn't like the first approach very much because, quite honestly, I didn't think I could consistently outplay the best players who were also going to use the standard team. For example, I knew going into this tournament that the Charizard, Groudon, Zacian, Grimmsnarl, Gastrodon, and Incineroar team would be really popular, but in my head I was like, okay, if I can't really figure out a way to optimize it to beat everybody else and I'm just using the same sets, what's going to allow me to beat my opponents if they're also using the same team, right? Yes, I could rely on my playing abilities, but at the same time, there are many players who have grinded with kind of, one or two comps a lot more than I have. Whereas I've tried out a lot of different teams, but haven't really, used one composition for more than maybe 10 or 15 games at most. So for that reason, I didn't think I could consistently win against the best players by using what was just already the best, teams out there. So rather, I then decided to kind of look towards using something that few people would have prepared for. One thing about this format is that people will understand their matchups really well against the top compositions, but they won't practice nearly as hard against some of the more obscure restricted duos. So then I thought about, okay, well, I really want to use a restricted duo that's underrated and maybe not very popular at the moment. And so Solgaleo and Dialga was kind of the starting point that I had. I thought that both would be a pretty good meta call going into this event, but both Pokemon were obviously underexplored, and as a result, didn't really know how to, fully make them work, right? So I tried out a bunch of different Dialga teams, and the timeline for this, by the way, is just a week before the tournament. So I think that, you can get a lot of efficient and good practice in just under a week, and you need to be smart about how you approach practice as well. So I was grinding out a lot of games online, and just nothing was really sticking. And unfortunately, all the Dialga ideas I had, none were really super, super good in my eyes. But I then actually stumbled upon a Choice Scarf Groudon and Solgaleo team initially built by a player called Jonas, who I've linked down in the description below, and he had used this team in an international challenge and actually posted a paste on it online. So I ran into it and I thought like it was really, really intriguing, and basically wanted to take that idea, adapt it, and then just try to optimize it for my personal playstyle. And so the original idea of the team fully comes from Jonas. I really appreciate him for making his team public and sharing it. And so basically 2 days before regionals, I think on essentially Wednesday, I had seen this and I was like, okay, I really want to make this work, and now time to figure out how to optimize it fully. So I think I played probably 100 games between those couple of days to figure out final EV spreads and moves and just understand the general playstyle of the team. And so that's kind of where the team building process started and ended. So now let's actually take a look at the team itself. First of all, here is a rental if you don't want to try out yourselves in the game, and figured I would just flash this up on screen so you can see all the sets. Like I mentioned, rental and paste are also down in the description below if you want to try it out yourselves. So the overall objective of this team, first of all, it centered around Choice Scarf, Groudon to use Bulldoze to activate Weakness Policy on Solgaleo. Now, Choice Scarf, not a very common item on Groudon at all, and so that in itself was already really intriguing to me. And I also, really like the Weakness Policy Solgaleo, and there are plenty of ways you can activate it, whether it be Brutal Swing on Tornadus, Shadow Sneak from Mimikyu, Bulldoze from the Groudon, but the synergy there made a lot of sense, right? So the overall goal with this team was basically to overwhelm your opponent and knock their Pokemon out before they can even attack. And Bulldoze is really valuable because Solgaleo, thanks to its ability, does not have its speed dropped even when you go for Bulldoze. And so with Scarf Groudon, you can drop things speeds and then allow Solgaleo to essentially just outspeed them. Now, this team had a lot of heavy hitting offense. You had Gigantamax Charizard with Life Orb, you had Solgaleo with Weakness Policy, and I also had the Ancient Power Tech on Charizard, which I thought would be a really good meta call going into this event because I figured, okay, there's going to be a ton of Sun teams that I'm going to run into, and if I have Ancient Power, it just allows me to really hard win the mirror matchup, even if I lose the turn 1 speed tie between our Charizards. And so this team can pick up a lot of surprise one-hit knockouts with Max Rockfall Charizard as well as +2 Dynamax Solgaleo, and the idea is to basically just KO your opponent before they can even get an attack off. And this team often would just win the game on the first turn because it would be able to just get a one-hit KO onto a Dynamax Pokemon before they can even move. I also wanted to make it really confusing for my opponent and make them struggle with speed control. The team that we have here features both Tailwind and Trick Room, and it's really difficult to cover for both of those options, especially with your lead matchup specifically. So I wanted to induce kind of more mind games for my opponent and make it harder for them to consistently get the right speed control up. Finally, the overall goal is to just maximize your early game damage output with your Dynamax. That's going to almost always be Charizard or Solgaleo, and then clean things up with the late game Groudon on Charizard since they're decently fast and have really good spread type attacks. Now jumping into the individual breakdown of each Pokemon, we're starting off with Choice Scarf Groudon here, and so not a very complicated EV spread. The speed investment there allows you to just outspeed Max Speed Zacian and Calyrex Shadow Rider. You could invest even more just to cover for players that are, trying to speed creep for that specific speed stat. But yeah, max attack and then just the rest in HP. Moveset here, pretty standard: Fire Punch, Precipice Blades, Rock Tomb, and Bulldoze. There are actually a lot of different moves you can use on Scarf Groudon. At one point I had Stone Edge over Rock Tomb, but I thought Stone Edge is just way too inconsistent at 80% accuracy, so I ended up scrapping it, although I initially had it because it would give me a favorable matchup into opposing Charizards, even Gigantamax Charizard. You can also run things like Heat Crash or Heavy Slam, but I wanted Fire Punch just because it was a little bit more consistent in terms of damage output across the board, and yeah, I didn't feel the need for moves like Heavy Slam or Heat Crash. And then Precipice Blades and Bulldoze don't really need any explanation there, but the main thing with this Groudon is that with that speed investment, you will be able to outspeed Max Speed Zacian and Calyrex Shadow Rider, meaning that the only thing you're slower to in this format is Regieleki and other random Choice Scarf Pokemon, but Regieleki not really that much of a threat to a Groudon since of course we're ground type, so that was not too much of a fear. The next Pokemon here is Weakness Policy Solgaleo, and so this was just super standard as well, and I had some Steel Strike, Earthquake, Wild Charge, and Protect. Now, the original version of this team that I had seen actually had a slightly slower Solgaleo, and it was combined with Max Speed Indeedee, so that Indeedee could actually activate Weakness Policy on Solgaleo before Solgaleo attacks. But going into this tournament, I just really wanted to have Max Speed to, one, outspeed other Solgaleos, which would often be a little bit bulkier, and I also wanted to guarantee that I outsped the base 95s like Huron White, as well as the base 90s like Kyogre and Groudon. So I was okay going with Max Speed for this event. And the moveset here, Solgaleo does get access to a lot of strong attacks. You can have a rock type attack, a psychic type attack as well, and I initially had Psychic Fangs for two reasons. One, Indeedee is on this team, so you can set up the Psychic terrain for Solgaleo to do more damage, and then two, breaking through screens is also obviously valuable, but I figured Wild Charge, especially +2 max lightning into things like Kyogre and Yveltal, can just get a one-hit knockout on those Pokemon even when they're Dynamax potentially. And so for that reason, I made the switch to Wild Charge pretty last second the day before the event, but ultimately don't regret it. I think you can go with Psychic Fangs as well, but my problem with Psychic Fangs is I didn't think there'd actually be too many opportunities to use it at a point where I could break the screens and actually have value. Because with Solgaleo, you want to Dynamax so frequently early on that you're not really going to be able to break your opponent's screens until after the Dynamax. So that's one reason why I also opted for Wild Charge in the end. Next Pokemon here is Gigantamax Charizard, and this set is really standard, but the one thing to note is that there's Ancient Power here rather than something like Blast Burn or Solar Beam. So one thing to note with Charizard is that a lot of players like to run attacks like Blast Burn as well as Hurricane to increase the base power of your max move when you're Gigantamaxed. Now, that can have really good trade-offs when you are max, but it means that when you're not Dynamax, you are considerably weaker. And so I actually use Charizard very frequently with this team in non-max form just to clean games up, and as a result, Heat Wave and Air Slash were more consistent. Ancient Power was the main tech that I already mentioned before, but I figured this would give me a really huge advantage against opposing Sun teams that like to prioritize maxing Charizard. And so Ancient Power here, a move that, I really, really liked and helped me win a lot of matchups against opposing Charizard teams. And, the eventual champion of Salt Lake City actually had Ancient Power and Chardy Berry, so he was really 2 steps ahead of the metagame, had ways to beat Charizards and cover for opposing rock type attacks as well, which was really brilliantly done. So yeah, main thing to note here is that Heat Wave's really valuable for damage output here, and Blast Burn for the stronger base power is really tempting, but for this Charizard it is important to have value outside of max and to be able to just spread a lot of damage even after max is over. The next Pokemon here is Indeedee Female. Now, the original version of this team that I had seen actually ran a really fast Indeedee with Focus Sash, but I wanted Whimsicott with Sash on this team, and so I was like, okay, if Sash is taken, I might as well just throw a Psychic Seed on Indeedee, and I'll just make it really bulky instead, because in my practice games, I didn't really have too many scenarios where I would actually lead Indeedee Solgaleo and just activate Policy before Solgaleo could attack anyway, so I scrapped the idea of the faster Indeedee and just went for max HP, max defense here, which allows you to, take attacks from Zacian as well as you can. So the moveset here is standard Expanding Force, Follow Me, Helping Hand, and Protect. I will note that I considered Heal Pulse, Mystical Fire, and Shadow Ball, and I think I actually initially had Heal Pulse in testing, but it wasn't super relevant, and so leading to the event, I was like, one, I don't know if I absolutely need it. Helping Hand is just a little bit more consistent for me, and 2, it takes a little bit longer to get Heal Pulse Indeedee within the game as well, since it's an egg move. And so yeah, I ended up scrapping Heal Pulse before the event. And Mystical Fire and Shadow Ball are both interesting. I didn't really feel like I needed Mystical Fire because Ferrothorn wasn't really a major problem. And Shadow Ball is pretty valuable in Calyrex Shadow Rider while also self-activating Policy, but I didn't think I had a super bad Calyrex matchup. So just went with a relatively standard moveset here, and the min speed just allows you to win the speed war against Rillaboom, so you can lead Indeedee safely and almost always guarantee that your Psychic terrain will go up after Grassy Surge sets up the grassy terrain. So that's Indeedee. Next Pokemon on the team here is Mimikyu. Now, I knew I wanted to use Safety Goggles Mimikyu going into this event because I saw a lot of Amoonguss, a lot of Porygon 2, Dusclops, and Trick Room stuff in general. And so Mimikyu is a nice Pokemon because, one, it keeps your opponents guessing because it gets, access to 6 or 7 good moves, including Will-O-Wisp. And Mimikyu is also valuable here because, 1, it could obviously activate Policy on Solgaleo, but 2, Play Rough is actually really good damage output here, especially into Palkia and Yveltal, which were Pokemon that I expected to see a decent amount going into this tournament. So pretty standard moveset of Shadow Sneak, Play Rough, Trick Room, and Taunt, and just max attack, max HP. The damage output from Mimikyu is honestly decent, especially with same type attack bonus coming out from Play Rough. And I wanted Goggles because this set just completely demolishes Amoonguss. Things like Amoonguss, Indeedee, Porygon 2, Dusclops, they all struggle against this Mimikyu because you can taunt them and essentially force them to switch out, right? And so Goggles just makes it so much easier where I can even, ignore potential Rage Powders from the Amoonguss, but also just have Mimikyu as a switch into Amoonguss and, basically not care about what they had to do. So yeah, I didn't really feel the need for any more bulk here. I think max HP was fine, and the attack investment was really nice just to maximize damage output from Play Rough. And Trick Room here, is kind of a double-sided option. The first one is to use it to actually set up Trick Room for ourselves. Now, Solgaleo and Groudon on this team are actually kind of speedy, so you're not always going to do that, but it's also valuable in reversing opposing Trick Rooms. And there are some matchups where you're going up against very fast-paced offense where it is valuable for Mimikyu to just click Trick Room immediately. So yeah, Mimikyu is just great for a bunch of different reasons. 1, it's ghost typing, being immune to Fake Out, and then 2, Disguise is obviously a really good ability here as well. Finally, to round things out, we had a classic Focus Sash Prankster Whimsicott here with Sunny Day, Tailwind, Moonblast, and Protect. I knew that I wanted Whimsicott for another means of speed control with this team, and initially I just had Tailwind, Moonblast, Protect. I was trying to figure out what 4th move to use, and I ended up on Sunny Day just because it allowed me to lead Whimsicott and Charizard and have a lot of options right from turn 1. I also knew that there would be a lot of Kyogre going into this event, and just even setting up a Sunny Day as Kyogre tries to go for a Water Spout and reducing the damage output that your partner Pokemon takes is really valuable. So considered options like Encore, Taunt, Helping Hand, and Fake Tears, but ultimately I like Sunny Day just to give me another mode and another lead composition that I could go with Whimsicott and Charizard specifically. So now that we've talked about the Pokemon, I want to basically list some sample cores that I often used, and this is not basically a definitive here's how to use the team, but just some examples of lead matchups that I liked with Pokemon in the back. So Groudon and Solgaleo was an incredibly effective lead against teams that just didn't have great ways to stop Groudon from going for a turn 1 Bulldoze, and then Whimsicott and Charizard really good in cleaning games up. Mimikyu and Solgaleo was really valuable because, one, you can't click Fake Out onto Mimikyu, and so, I could almost always guarantee that Policy would get activated on Solgaleo, and if they didn't have great damage output to threaten Solgaleo on turn 1, this could just really overwhelm your opponent immediately. Indeedee and Charizard actually ended up being a lead that I really liked, especially into opposing Sun teams, because Indeedee could protect the Charizard, while Charizard could go for something like a Max Rockfall on opposing Charizards, right? Or go for a Max Airstream, as Indeedee basically redirects any damage away from Charizard. And so this one, doesn't pack as much of a punch immediately, but can still pick up one-hit knockouts thanks to the Helping Hand support from Indeedee. And the main idea is to, use Charizard early, sacrifice Indeedee, maybe get a speed boost onto Solgaleo or Groudon with the Max Airstream, and then close out the game with it. Charizard Groudon, always an effective lead as well, where you just, threatening with the sun immediately, especially valuable if they don't have weather control from something like a Kyogre. And then Whimsicott Charizard, as I mentioned, also a fun lead here because you've got Sunny Day and Tailwind Pressure on Whimsicott. And Charizard being at base 100 is actually faster than most of the Pokemon that you're going to run into in the format outside of things like Thundurus, Aleki, Calyrex, and Zacian. Those are, all common Pokemon, but there are teams that don't run any of those, right? And so against those teams, you can punish it really, really heavily. So these are just some examples of ways that I had played with the team, right? But that doesn't mean that you have to exclusively go with one of these modes. These were just the ones that felt the most consistent over a long course of time. But I think the fun thing about this team is that there's so much flexibility in how you can approach the lead matchup and the final 2 Pokemon. So as I mentioned, I also wanted to have an idea of how to approach the game versus the common team compositions that I expected to see. So I've listed, the 5 main restricted duos I thought would be popular going into this event, and basically some advice on how I would approach it. With Kyogre and Zacian, the first thing I would basically try to do is confirm the item on Kyogre and identify whether or not it's Scarfed or not. Because if you're not Choice Scarf, Solgaleo can just outspeed it, and you can just go Mimikyu Solgaleo and just Shadow Sneak into a Max Lightning immediately onto Kyogre. Solgaleo is also really nice because of its ability to increase its defenses via max moves, and so that goes a long way in this matchup as well. And then Groudon just really effective in cleaning out the game against Zacian in the late game. So Dynamax Solgaleo, most of the time, you're really just utilizing your max boost, and then, take advantage of the fact that you outspeed non-Scarf Kyogre, so try to confirm early whether or not it's Scarf or not. And since I knew this tournament was best of 3, I had room to maybe drop a game just for information from my opponent's end. So trying to confirm the item as quickly as possible in Kyogre was really important. Against Groudon and Zacian, my general goal was to win the Charizard war, right? And basically use my Charizard to pick up a one-hit knockout onto opposing Charizards with Max Rockfall. Indeedee is also really good support from Charizard because it can redirect super effective attacks away from the Charizard, allowing it to, and Indeedee can take, rock-type attacks with relative ease. And then the other thing that I often wanted to note when playing against these teams was confirming the set on Grimmsnarl, whether it was Trick Iron Ball, which had been the initial version that we'd seen on these compositions, or just dual screens. It was also really valuable confirming the kind of speed control on Grimmsnarl, because if you're running Scary Face, then the Solgaleo actually doesn't care about it, and if you're running Thunder Wave, then, we have to keep that in mind, but Indeedee setting up Psychic Terrain with Follow Me can dissuade them from going for that, right? And so, figuring out the type of speed control from Grimmsnarl, always valuable, and just figuring out the Grimmsnarl set as well. Against Yveltal and Zacian, this was actually, out of the 5 duos here, the one that I played against the least, and so this one probably felt like a more neutral to negative matchup, mainly because Yveltal is just scary. And basically the first thing I would do if I were playing against it is to confirm whether or not I had foul play or not, because some sets just don't have room for foul play, like you run Dark Pulse, Heat Wave, Flying type attack, and Protect. And so if they don't have foul play, it's a lot easier to actually activate the policy on Solgaleo, whereas if they do have foul play, you have to be really, really careful about activating that policy. The key thing to note is that you can have, +2 Max Lightning or Groudon plus Charizard with something like Rock Tomb into G-Max Wildfire to just try to quickly KO the Dynamax Yveltal, but this matchup scared me a lot in theory. Against Calyrex and Zacian, Groudon and Solgaleo was just really strong in general, I found, especially if they didn't lead Fake Out, and you can just bulldoze into KOing something immediately. And Groudon, obviously, with the Choice Scarf, can outspeed both Zacian and Calyrex and pressure both with a ton of damage. Trick Room is also valuable into these matchups often because they are pretty fast-paced, and so that's one thing I would look for as well. And then for Calyrex, Ice Rider, and Palkia, Mimikyu was by far the MVP here, basically using it to taunt everything. Play Rough just did good damage across the board, and I can reverse opposing Trick Rooms as well. And then Solgaleo just had a really favorable matchup into a lot of the Pokemon on those teams as well. So Mimikyu normally would be the MVP just by spreading taunt and preventing them from setting up Trick Room, and then Solgaleo would really clean up in terms of damage. So now that we've covered the team, I wanted to walk through the games that I had at Salt Lake Regionals and basically go over some key matches and highlight some of the things that worked well for me and also things that maybe didn't work out as well as I would have liked in the tournament. So rounds 1 through 4, I actually played against 4 different team compositions in Groudon, Zacian, Kyogre, Solgaleo, Palkia, Zacian, and Calyrex, Zacian. So this was really cool to see. Like, I just didn't expect so much diversity, but, you know, in the early rounds of a tournament, you can really run into anything. So in round 1, I had actually essentially won the first game off turn 1 from Max Rockfall, being able to surprise my opponent's Charizard. So that gave me a lot of confidence in running this tech going into this event. And in the second game, I almost won the game on the first turn, but my Gmax Wildfire from Life Orb Charizard in Sun did not one-shot their Groudon, and it missed out on the KO by like 5%, so then I was wondering, shoot, like maybe I should have run Blast Burn for this event rather than Heat Wave. And my opponent, Min, actually had Weakness Policy Incineroar with Bulldoze on the Groudon, which was really interesting. And so by failing to pick up the KO on turn 1, that kind of spiraled out of control, and then Max Incineroar was a pretty big problem for me. But in game 3, had a good lead adjustment and just commanded control of the game right from the beginning. So, started off the tournament 1-0. In the second round, I went up against a player called Nicholas with Solgaleo and Kyogre. Definitely a restricted duel that I did not have much practice against, but I figured I had a pretty good advantage here because my Solgaleo was max speed. I have Tailwind on my team, so if I match their Tailwind, then, you know, my Solgaleo should just be faster unless they have Choice Scarf. And so one thing I wanted to do in this set was confirm whether or not Kyogre or Entei had Scarf here. The other thing I had to really be careful about was Entei burning me with Sacred Fire on Solgaleo, and that actually did happen in the final match, I believe, but it was still, I had a big enough lead where it didn't end up making a difference. And then one other thing I always like to confirm is, you know, the sets on Grimmsnarls when I go up against it, whether or not, Scary Face, Thunder Wave, or Trick Iron Ball, or even other variants, for example. So Solgaleo being able to outspeed my opponent here was a really big deal, and just, you know, was able to threaten almost everything for a one-hit knockout in this matchup. So 2-0 after the first 2 rounds. Round 3, I went up against a player called Ben, and I took my first loss of the event in terms of a set loss. It was really frustrating because I had made a major blunder in the first game, in the first turn of our first game. My opponent Ben knew like he didn't have a really good matchup, and so he actually led Ditto in both the first and the third match of our set, which induces a lot of variance, right? Leading Ditto can be a really high risk, high reward strategy, and in the first game, he had led Ditto plus Grimmsnarl against my Mimikyu and Solgaleo. I'd actually forgotten about the fact that Sunsteel Strike goes through Disguise, so I was like, okay, I'm just going to protect Solgaleo to prevent any Thunder Waves onto me turn 1, taunt into Grimmsnarl, then turn 2 I can just self-Shadow Sneak, activate Policy, and then my Solgaleo can just sweep, right? Well, not so easy. I had forgotten about the Ditto copying Solgaleo and then using Sunsteel Strike to go through Disguise, so I essentially lost the game on the first turn because I lost Mimikyu and didn't get Policy off, and then his Grimmsnarl didn't even go for like a status condition onto my Solgaleo, so it ended up just being the absolute worst case scenario. In game 2, he didn't lead Ditto, and I just used the matchup and really, you know, outmaneuvered to win a game. And then in game 3, the end game comes down to Choice Scarf Groudon, you know, plus a partner against Zacian and Palkia, and basically he needs a double protect and a Precipice Blades miss to basically keep themselves in the game, and gets the double protect with Zacian, and I miss Precipice Blades on Palkia. So I think if one of the two don't happen, my Groudon's in a really prime position to win. I still need to hit some Precipice Blades afterwards, but the combination of that meant that I had no chance to win the game. So, you know, it showed me the reality like, hey, like I am putting myself in situations where I have to hit inaccurate moves to win the end game, and that can be really scary. So this was a frustrating loss, mainly because I threw away one game by completely forgetting about a mechanic that I really should have known. And yeah, I got unlucky to lose the other game, but like, you know, I shouldn't have let that first game, you know, even become a loss, right? And so afterwards, this is a great example of how you can learn after a match, and I kind of just sat down and evaluated all the ways you can KO Mimikyu through Disguise, and ignored the Disguise and just double check that. And so if I ran into any other players in the event, I would not get screwed up by that mechanic. But obviously it feels bad to drop a matchup that felt very winnable, and to my opponent's credit, they did a really good job identifying that Ditto as a lead has a lot of potential, so props to them there. In round 4, I went up against Emilio, who was actually the runner-up from Worlds in 2018. He actually had a Grimmsnarl over the Incineroar, I believe, but, you know, the key strategy for him was to just overwhelm with Hyper Offense from Calyrex and Zacian. And in the first game, I essentially won after the first turn because he led with Grimmsnarl Calyrex, and I had Groudon plus Solgaleo, and Bulldoze into Sunsteel Strike just KO'd the Calyrex immediately, and he went for the fake tears onto my Groudon and tried to Astral Barrage. So got a free knockout there. It actually still ended up being really close because Grimmsnarl was able to spread some paras with Thunder Wave, and so I had to attack through some full paras in the end game, which was really nerve-wracking, but Charizard was able to clutch it out. And in the second match, he had ended up leading with the Blastoise, and I had anticipated that, so I had gone with the Indeedee, and Indeedee, you know, allowed me to protect my Charizard, which I'd led with, and Charizard put in a lot of work as well. So yeah, you know, this was a big confidence booster. Emilio's a phenomenal player, you know, Worlds runner-up a few years ago, as I mentioned, but also just one of the kind of older VGC players, and he's just been very, very good. And so I felt like I won mainly off having a really good team matchup, but, you know, my first 2-0 win throughout the event, that definitely instills a lot more confidence and momentum, and building up confidence is honestly a really big deal for live events. So after the first 4 rounds, I was 3-1, and now we go into the second half of the event. Once again, a bunch of different interesting cores here. I actually ran into a Kyurem White and Zacian team here, but Solgaleo here, being max speed, gave me a really good advantage into the Kyurem. Sableye was pretty scary though, so I had to do a good job playing around that, but, you know, I, like, in the first game didn't bring Indeedee, which allowed Sableye to be a little bit disruptive, and then my adjustment going into the second match was to just have Indeedee in the back and make sure Sableye couldn't disrupt me very much. Round 6 was actually streamed, and, you know, this is a game that I actually probably will want to review on the channel, but it's one in which Max Rockfall essentially won me the game immediately on the first turn of the first match, and then the second game was a little bit closer. He made a great adjustment leading Raichu. I wanted to be cognizant of, like, Electro Web from that Pokemon, so try to cover for that option, and managed to end up eking out with the win. And in round 7, I went up against what was one of the most interesting teams in this event, featuring Pikachu and Butterfree. The first win in this match I just had completely stolen. Like, I only won because he missed a Heat Wave onto my Charizard, and he had actually set up Sunny Day with his Whimsicott, allowing my Charizard to just sweep with Heat Wave in the end game there. So game 1 was a game in which I had basically gotten really lucky to win. It was a game that I should have lost, and so I wanted to keep that in mind. The other scary thing was in game 1, like, he had led with Butterfree and Charizard, and I had gone with Whimsicott and Charizard, and I kind of forgot about the fact that Charizard from his end could max Airstream to give his Butterfree a speed boost. And I was like, okay, Butterfree is going to be sashed here, so I'm just going to Moonblast and Airstream into the Butterfree. But because I lost the speed tie, my Charizard got put to sleep, and so it felt like the game was doomed, but because I got a little bit lucky with the Heat Wave miss in the end, was actually able to win. And then the second game had just made a little bit better of an adjustment to make sure that I don't fall, you know, prey to the Charizard Butterfree duo once again. And it was really close, but in the end, it was one in which I think I had an early lead and was able to kind of just go from there. So at this point, I was 6-1 going into the final round. Now, the way these events work is that you normally need a, you can only afford 1 loss if you want to guarantee a spot in the top 8. Going into this final round, I knew that I actually had played a lot of players with decently high records, and so normally, you know, maybe 1 or 2, sometimes 3 players who've taken 2 losses can actually eke into the top 8, but it's never something you want to rely on because it depends on then how all of your opponents have done in the tournament, right? And so I actually went up against the eventual champion in round 8, and he crushed me with Incineroar Grimmsnarl. So when we played in round 8, he led Instant Grim both times and then would have the Groudon and the Charizard in the back. And so I just really struggled to get good damage onto his side in both games. And so, yeah, like they were close, but it just felt like he was one step ahead, and like I had no way to really stop the early screens, and I made really poor use out of my Dynamax/Gigantamax in my round 8 set against him. So ended up losing 0-2 to finish 6-2 throughout the first 8 rounds. And so at that point, I didn't know if I was going to make it into the top 8 or not, but I had just eked in, and, you know, my opponents did just well enough that I actually made it in as the 8th and final seed going into top 8. So, you know, I spent a lot of time preparing for the top 8 set, but I knew it was going to be really difficult. The dynamic of this matchup is really hard because he had Ancient Power and Chardy Berry on Charizard, so he hard won the Charizard matchup. It wasn't even like remotely close between Charizards. And so I had expected him to lead with Incineroar and Grimmsnarl when we played again in the top 8, and so I, you know, had come up with this strategy where you have Indeedee plus Solgaleo, and I knew that the Charizard on his end only had Blast Burn as the fire type attack. So the idea was to use Solgaleo early game, bait him into activating weakness policy on Solgaleo and go from there. But he did such a good job adjusting. He didn't lead Grimmsnarl plus the Insane. Instead, he went with Charizard Groudon, had a lot of good damage immediately, and was also really smart to bring Gastrodon as final Pokemon, which I had not seen at all in the previous games I had against him. So the first round I played against him in top 8, I felt like I played perfectly and I still lost, and that was really frustrating because it just felt like there was truly nothing I could have done in order to win that. So second time around, I basically changed up the leads. I went with Indeedee and Charizard, and I essentially gambled the game away on turn 1. He had gone with Charizard and Groudon again, and I was like, okay, you're probably going to max Groudon here, and my Indeedee did actually survive the G-Max Wildfire from his Charizard in the previous game with Psychic Seed. So I was like, well, if I go for Follow Me, you Blast Burn, and you miss or you don't KO me, or I win the Speed tie with Charizard, and then Groudon maxes and just Rock Falls into Indeedee, I should just win the game, honestly, off turn 1. But unfortunately, his Charizard won the Speed tie, hit the Blast Burn, and it actually got the roll to knock out Indeedee, and then Max Rockfall just KO'd my Charizard. So it was a gamble that I was willing to take because this matchup was honestly abysmal, and there's just so little that I could have done safely, and so I was willing to, you know, go for a big play, but ultimately I was not able to win a single game in my 4 attempts, right? And it's because he's a fantastic player who also made really good adjustments between when we played in the final round and then in top 8 as well. So in the end, that ultimately concluded my tournament run, and so I finished 8th out of about 160 players or so in the event. This is just a screenshot from Victory Road if you want to see all the different teams, especially in the top 8, that players ended up using. I felt pretty good about my metagame analysis because most of the teams here were things that I expected to see, although I would say both Zach and Jeremy, you know, they had Calyrex plus Solgaleo as well as Kyogre plus Necrozma. Those were definitely comps that I wasn't as prepared for, you know, didn't really expect to see. So kudos to them for, you know, making it to the top 8 with some really cool team comps. But at the top, you know, very classic Zacian Groudon, Zacian Kyogre, Zacian Groudon. And so I at least was happy that my, you know, metagame analysis was validated, but Chongjun just had a really smart adaptation of the Sun team with the Chardy and the Ancient Power on Charizard, as well as Shook on Incin. The Resist Berries basically made the matchup a nightmare for me because I could not really pick up a one-hit KO onto anything easily in this matchup, and just them surviving for one more attack and stalling out one more turn of Dynamax is a really, really big deal in the matchup. So yeah, pretty cool to see the diversity though in the top 8 in terms of restricted duos here. So when it was all said and done, I ended up finishing 8th out of 163 players. I went 6-3 in sets and 13-8 in games, but Chongjun definitely brought a lot of the L's to the table here as, you know, if you remove him from the equation, I went 6-1, and then, you know, I dropped 4 games on a road to him as well. And so basically, reflecting on the tournament, I felt like I had a really good team/matchup against most of the teams that I faced in the event. Outside of Chongjun, I actually felt like I had a favorable matchup in all of the matches, and I felt like all of the losses that I had were preventable, which is honestly a really good feeling, right? Because it means like, yeah, I lost, but it was off my opponent playing really well or me misplaying, but it doesn't mean that it was the team's fault that I lost. It was often me not doing a good enough job to win with the resources that I had. However, credits to Chongjun here, right, because his team was just an absolute nightmare to deal with, and it was mainly because of the Charizard set with Ancient Power and Chardy Berry, but also because of the Shuka Berry on Incineroar. It was just amazing how he, you know, made some slight adaptations to a team that was already really good. The original version of the Charizard team, you know, had Grimmsnarl with Iron Ball, and so this variant had likely dual screens. It had Ancient Power Chardy on Charizard, and it had the Shuka Berry on the Incineroar. So the combination of all three just allowed him to have a really favorable matchup into pretty much everything like he could run into, and this was absolutely his tournament to win, man, and he did such a good job. So congratulations to him on going undefeated, and I think he dropped 2 games total in the entire tournament, which is an absolutely crazy statistic. A couple of other things I want to talk about with this team. Using it can be really stressful, so I want to warn you, because you're often relying on inaccurate attacks like Heat Wave and Precipice Blades in the end games, and a lot of the games in which like I ended up closing out, I was like, okay, you know, I win the game the majority of the time, but if I miss this Precipice Blades or Heat Wave, I actually probably lose. And so it's really scary. You know, you play yourself to a position where it feels like, you know, all you need to do is just hit one final attack, but all it takes is one miss to undo all the work that you put in. And so I do want to caveat that, but one of the reasons I figured I'd be willing to take some of those risks is because this was a best of 3 tournament rather than best of 1. So I could afford to lose a game or 2 from missing. But one thing to note is that in end games, I'd often look for opportunities where I could use the 100% accurate attacks like Bulldoze or Fire Punch rather than relying on Precipice Blades, because a miss is such a big deal with the Groudon. One other thing to note is that a big strength of this team is the surprise factor. So now that people know about Choice Scarf Groudon and Solgaleo, like when I see Groudon and Solgaleo now, I would expect it to be Scarf Groudon rather than anything else, right? And so losing the surprise factor definitely makes the strategy a lot weaker. And so that's one thing to keep in mind as well. I think, yes, it is still viable. Yes, it can still be strong, but you do have to keep in mind that a lot of the wins I had with this team throughout this tournament was my opponent just losing on turn 1 because they had no idea it'd be Choice Scarf Groudon. And now that element of surprise does not exist as much. Finally, I have to note that a lot of people are using Chongjun's team right now, especially with the Chardian Ancient Power tech from Charizard. I think that's only going to increase in popularity from here on out, and so you really have to adjust the team if you want a better matchup against that, because the reality is that, like, the team that, you know, I felt like I had a good matchup against everything, but then I ran into Chongjun, and that was a nightmare matchup. It almost felt unwinnable, and, you know, even when you have a bad matchup, you can still win if your opponent maybe doesn't make the best plays, but Chongjun honestly just played incredibly with his team. And so, yeah, you're going to see his team everywhere, and right now, as where it stands, this team does not have an incredibly good matchup into it. In fact, it's a very negative matchup, and so I encourage you to do some thinking about adjusting the team so that you have a better matchup specifically against the Chardy Ancient Power Zard as well as the Shukaberry on Incineroar. That being said, you know, I'm not saying that this team is, you know, gonna fall off or that it's weak by any means, but I just want to keep all of these things in mind and for you to be realistic with yourselves as you try it out, because teams, especially teams like this that rely on element of surprise, they do get a little bit weaker and harder to use once your opponents know what's coming their way. So, before we wrap up for this video, I just wanted to give some thank yous. First of all, to Jonas, the original person who had created the idea of Choice Scarf Groudon and Solgaleo that I had seen. And so huge thank you to him for posting his team from the International Challenge. That was the team that, you know, really inspired this entire team. And so, you know, I was able to take some ideas and adapt them to make them, I think, a little bit more optimized for the metagame, but Jonas was the one who had come up with the original idea, so huge thank you to him. I would like to thank Aaron, Trailer, and Wolf for just helping me play through in theory through a lot of concepts and matchups and practicing, you know, the week leading up to the event. My friend Mike for helping me get the team together in game, and finally all of you all for watching the stream and for supporting the content and just my, you know, competitive career as well. It's been a while since I have competed, but it felt really good to play on stage again, and I still don't have definitive plans as to whether or not I'll, you know, play the rest of the season or commentate some events as well. I definitely want to be involved in both though, and so, you know, we'll see, but either way, it was so good to be back out on the field, and honestly had a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoyed trying out this team, and I was really happy to have put in a good performance with a relatively unique strategy as well. So overall, you know, it would have been great to win the event, but losing to Chongjun, who just had such an amazing run, like, that was his tournament to win, and so yeah, huge congrats to him. And, you know, even though losing never feels good, I think I felt relatively happy about how I played the tournament, and that top 8 matchup, sometimes you just run into really tough matchups and you run into really good players, you're not going to be able to win all of those, right? And so yeah, that's going to conclude it for the team and tournament report. I really hope you enjoyed. Leave a like if you did, and I'll see you all soon. All right, peace.